So thank you. This was a fascinating and compelling presentation. I want to sort of go through various of the implications for people like those in this room who've thought about these issues for a long time. First, I have to ask you, if this were a political talk show, if we were in DC, there'd have to be some allusion to the debate over climate change, the debate over global warming, the debate over mankind's role in it. What is the state of the world outside the United States? Is there an idea of the debate or not? How should Americans think about the fact that we always talk about this as a debate?
Since you used the word debate, let me refer back to a line from the president's speech last week when he said, "We don't have time for a debate of the Flat Earth Society." And he's emphatically right. This is simple math. You put carbon in the atmosphere, it's an insulation blanket. We can calculate how much carbon we're putting in. We can watch the temperature change. It's not complicated. So it's not a debate anywhere in the world except where it's been manufactured by people whose interests will be threatened.
So to say something about the president's speech, I think there's there's an important point of context about the president's speech. In the beginning of his second term, when he knows the clock is running, he's never going to run for re-election again, there have been three areas where he's laid down a marker. One was, of course, on gun policy, and we know, despite the moving presentation by Mark Kelly and Gabby Giffords, that without the Congress, there's almost nothing he can do about that. The second was in declaring very significantly that the war on terror had to come to an end. And there are things he can do about that, but he's in the middle of these two wars. And the third was announcing more clearly than he had before that climate change was an issue and a challenge and a moral challenge. How important did you think his speech and the ramifications thereof are?
I think the president did an amazing job. There are two reasons why I say that. The first is substantive. He scoured the laws to understand what the executive can do without going back to Congress. And the most important things in that, in fact, he's obligated by law to regulate CO2 emissions from power plants. They're a pollutant under the terms of the Clean Air Act. He has no alternative but to do it. So he's getting it done. And today, the EPA handed over to the Office of Management and Budget the proposed regulations for controlling CO2 emissions from new power plants. That's a really big deal. And there's some other really big deals in there as well. But the other one is the whole question of moral leadership. He raised this to a moral issue. He didn't do the pragmatic thing of, well, we can have a few more green jobs. He said, this is a challenge for our generation. And it emphatically is a challenge for our generation. So I think with this moment, he changed the conversation. And I think the debates of the Flat Earth Society are going to be increasingly ridiculed. And it becomes a question of how rather than whether.
And if you take as a premise, I will assert as a premise that within the next couple of years, he has no chance of getting actual legislation through the Congress to address these issues. Is the realm of executive authority significant that what's within the president's control?
There's quite a bit that can be done. Remember that Obama also caused to double the fuel efficiency of the automobile fleet in America. That was a very big deal. What he's doing with coal plants is a big deal, and his work with HFCs in coordination with China. These have zeros behind them, a lot of zeros. They do not sum up to a national energy policy. And part of the problem is we don't set energy policy in Washington. There's nobody in Washington, D.C. whose job it is to write energy policy for this country. We've never had a national energy policy. It's done state by state very significantly, which is why the public utilities commissions are so important. But I think your bigger question is, what about Congress? I think it makes sense to put a bill before Congress, a very simple, very clean bill, and let them fight and see what happens. Because you gotta sometimes have the battle. You can't tippy-toe around it forever.
Yes, you got to have the battle. We know how that will turn out in the next 2 years, and we'll see in the longer term. Let me ask you a meta question that I imagine on the mind of most people in this room. The presentation, the title of your presentation is Fear and Hope. I thought the fear part was much more compelling and immediate than the hope part. You're talking about these global processes that are accelerating at breakneck pace, and that if we are able to do a number of these incremental changes, we have a chance of arresting them. It doesn't seem that hopeful.
Well, I'm more hopeful than I was 2 years ago. And there are two reasons for this. Technology can move very quickly into the marketplace. There's some technologies that move slowly, like a coal plant lasts 60 years. or longer. It lasts as long as you want. So you have to consciously shut those down. But there are others that just are whip fast. You know, solar energy, these small modular technologies don't have the constraints of the big lumbering giants. And on the demand side too, it's a technology revolution. These LED bulbs use 1/10 the energy of a standard light bulb. They're almost free, right? I mean, it's an amazing bargain. So technology saturation is unbelievably rapid when it gets going in certain realms. And I see those growth numbers. We're seeing double-digit growth numbers across every one of these technologies. The other is I give a number of talks at universities around the world, and they are ready to go. The students, the younger people, they're moving into this profession. They want to make a difference with this. They're not going to stand still. And we've already seen in the last election how important it is for that next demographic to take charge.
And we were talking earlier about the difference in attitude among some college audiences and some more mature audiences about their perspective on whether there is hope here. And I asked you about the analogy to attitudes on same-sex marriage, where you knew the turnover was inevitable and rapid because generation by age group, the opinion changed so starkly. How about the opinions on climate change? Does that also have a generational correlation?
It certainly has a generational correlation because a lot of these technologies are new. Mm-hmm. It's also because in people's hearts they understand it's such a big deal. Yeah. I just want to say one more thing about how fast things can turn over. When we had World War II, it was a defining moment for this country, and we had to mobilize amazingly. And we turned Detroit away from manufacturing cars into manufacturing war trucks and tanks, more or less overnight. So if you have some willpower, if you have some political will, you can get some things done. Right,
the U.S. went from making a couple of hundred airplanes a year to 100,000 airplanes a year within 3 years. But that, of course, is the idea that the United States can do anything when its attention is drawn. So the question is what will get its attention. One other question on the speed of transition. When the Chinese boom in solar power is discussed in D.C. or in industrial circles, it's often with condemnation for their destroying the price, for dumping things onto the market. Should that be viewed instead as a positive thing to have driven down the price so rapidly?
Brilliant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Hank Paulson said 2 days ago, we're attacking the Chinese for selling us cheap solar panels, and we're trying to double our coal exports to them. I mean, what? It's crazy, yeah. Right? No, look, a lot of solar companies went bankrupt. Why did they go bankrupt? Because their competitors beat the tar out of them. That's a good news story. Yeah.
So as you mentioned earlier, the members of this audience are influential in their personal spheres, and they have lots of influential networks of people in their communities, their businesses, their universities, and all the rest. What's the triage list of the things you would like people here to support? You had the three priorities of fossil fuels and energy efficiency and the renewables. In practical terms, if somebody goes back to Palo Alto or goes back to Atlanta, what message should these people be taking?
Well, the first and most important venue right now is a fairly obscure one, but therefore especially susceptible to this kind of intervention. And that's, I mentioned before, the Public Utilities Commissions. We spend globally about $5 trillion a year on energy. That money exists, that cash flow exists. The rules as to whether that money lands on green choices or brown choices are set significantly by Public Utilities Commissions. 60% of the carbon in America goes through pipes and wires that are regulated. So tell your governor who appoints these commissioners, and tell the commissioners themselves, you're ready for a change. Make it known. They get precious little input. They notice when they get it.
Yeah. And what are the main forces on the other side? Is it mainly fossil fuel companies? What do you view as the correlation of forces that you are trying to move?
There really are two types of forces. One are people who actually make a lot of money by hydrocarbons that they've bought that are embedded in the ground and for which they exact a profit when they are released into the atmosphere. And they will defend those assets to the nth degree. Now, mind you, if you live next to me and I decided I didn't want to put in a new septic system, I wouldn't be allowed to just dump all my sewage on your land. That's what they're doing, right? So it's an artificial asset. It's an artificial set of anticipated profits, but they fight hard to defend it. The other one is a more tricky one, which is, again, I'm going back to the utility system because that's where most of this change has to happen. Incumbent utilities are not the most dynamic actors in our technological society, right? They're kind of sleepy. They're run by civil engineers. I know I am one.
And they're risk averse for good reasons.
Right,
Yeah.
right. They have time constants that are in decades,
Yeah.
and they have never been subject to competition in a meaningful way. Most of them haven't.
Yeah.
And so it's institutional inertia rather than malevolence.
Yeah. So I'm hopping around among a number of topics just to get them out of the table before we turn to the audience. Again, if you had a fear and hope balance in which I am asserting the fear looked more fearsome, but we'll hope the hope kicks in, how should we think simultaneously about adaptation and mitigation efforts? That some of that carbon is going to be in there forever, as far as we're all concerned. Things are going to get warmer, even if every part of your program, the program is adopted. What else should we be thinking of? And in what framework?
You know, maybe the best thing that could happen in America is for every state to be required to do a serious study of the costs of adaptation with a meter sea level rise, which we're going to see this century, I predict, and with the extreme events. There are going to be so many zeros on that thing, they might look to avoid it. So I'm definitely in the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure camp, and I would put the vast majority of the money on avoiding the trouble rather than trying to, I mean, you can't really moat Florida. I don't know if you'd want to.
How many Floridians are here? There's only a few, so but there are enough that we won't make any Florida
but you're walking ankle deep in water in Miami in 2100 right now, the way things are going.
Yeah.
So.
And when it comes to how do you feel about the whole geoengineering? Is that a fantasy, or is that something that needs to be part of the arsenal of consideration?
It's a highly dangerous fantasy. When we try to mess with big, nonlinear, unstable geophysical systems that we don't understand, we're much more likely to do harm than good. I'll just give you one example. You can dump sulfur particles in the atmosphere and it make the sky white instead of blue, not what I want. And it would bounce off sunshine. White bounces off better than dark. However, you're still accumulating carbon emissions, and the ocean is still absorbing carbon emissions, and so the ocean becomes increasingly acidic. So you still kill all the marine life, even though you didn't warm up quite as much. And then let's say you do this for a couple decades, and then somebody forgets to maintain the machine, or there's a war, or civil disturbance, and you turn off that sulfur. You have to keep that thing going forever. Otherwise, you shock the system, and then things really will go kerblooey. So I think, I mean, the only kind of geoengineering I like is planting trees. I think that's a pretty good idea. Painting roofs white. There's a few things that make sense, but they tend to be at the community scale rather than the geo scale.
Let me ask you about one other thing of how we should fit it into our minds, which is coal. There's when I was living in China recently, I was talking to a lot of your counterparts there who were saying that even though they're going full speed ahead on every other kind of energy, they still are burning more and more coal, and so is India going to do, and so is Iran going to do, and all the rest. Is it a fantasy to think that we can limit the amount of coal? Should we concentrate on carbon sequestration or other efforts to dampen down the harmful effect of coal? So,
Jim, you've spent more time in China than me, and you know these issues incredibly well, so I'm going to ask you to answer your own question. I'll put in a note, but
yes, you can steer me towards the correct answer. But.
Yeah, right. China's not going to let the lights go out, and China has a lot of coal, and so China's going to burn a lot of coal. The rich industrialized nations, several of them, the UK, Northern Europe, the United States, are turning away from coal at actually a pretty rapid pace, and it's going to keep going. It'll go up and down. It's gone up for a couple of years in Germany, but it's going down. Same in the US. So we're going to prove that you can run a modern industrial society without coal. The Chinese adoption patterns, they compress decades into months. They will follow. They're already building much better coal plants than any that exist in America. A third of the plants they've built have been used to shut down the dirtiest old plants. That's pretty good. And they're talking openly about peak coal. So my question is, when does it happen, and how fast is the curve?
I hesitate to give any opinions at all in your presence, but my impression in China is that they just are going to keep burning more coal for a while. It will eventually peak. And the valuable thing that the U.S. can do is, with the close partnerships that you and many other people have forged between international and Chinese scientists, turning Chinese power plants into the world's laboratory to try to do this in as clean a fashion as possible. So Godspeed for what you and many others have been doing there. One other question, skipping around. You gave us, when you're talking about natural gas, you had a sort of apart from that Mrs. Lincoln type of, how is the play type of idea, because it could really cut emissions.
Yep.
On the other hand, it could be catastrophically worse than coal itself. In American politics and American industry right now, natural gas and fracking and shale gas is seen as the salvation in 15 different ways, energy independence, et cetera, et cetera. How do we think about this possible catastrophic risk that it includes of methane leakage?
So, again, at the meta level, if you're a crack addict, you don't switch to heroin, right? You really want a pathway off. Now, natural gas is a really beautiful fuel. It does burn clean. We do have a lot of it. And honestly, a lot of these renewables have issues. They all have issues. Every single energy source has issues. If it's a calm day and a hot day, you want your air conditioning to run. You want your lights to stay on. The right role for gas, in my opinion, is to turn on quick, to run hard, and to shut down. So you have a combined cycle natural gas turbine power plant that runs 200 or 300 hours a year, or even 1,000 hours a year. It plays an amazingly valuable role. We're taking this precious resource and we're using it exactly as we should, because we're balancing the renewables, and we need that. We don't have cost-effective batteries. Maybe we'll get them, but we don't have them. So I guess at the top level, you can say, should it be free to pollute the skies forever? Yeah. No. Even at the University of Chicago, they say no. And then you should say, to burn as much gas as we're burning, natural gas wells, these new fracking wells, decline incredibly rapidly. So within 3 years, they're about 70 or 80% gone. You got to go drill the next one, right? It's like the Red Queen in Alice of Wonderland. You have to keep running to stay still. So we have to ask, how much of our land are we going to turn into Pinedale, Wyoming? How much of our water are we going to threaten? Now, gas can be done well. I'm not anti-gas by any means, but I want to use it for what it's best, not just for every old thing.
And how about this crucial uncertainty about whether the leakage is a small thing or an enormous thing?
So the Environmental Protection Agency is doing a big study on this. There's a group of oil companies working with Environmental Defense Fund doing a study on this. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab is doing work on this. And I think within 3 or 4 years, we'll have a pretty good handle on this. There's some great new instrumentation that tells you these answers.
Yeah. So you've worked around the world on these issues. Most people in this audience, not all, but most are Americans. How should we think about the American role in global climate issues? Are we seen as a laggard? Are we seen as a force for good, in particular in dealing with the Chinese? So what is our country doing, and what else could it be doing?
If you go to the international stage where climate negotiations happen, I sometimes say this entire process was invented by Dick Cheney in order to ruin people's spirits and hearts about environmental protection. So don't get your hopes up for the UNFCCC to solve the problem. I wish they could do it, they won't. And they hate
the Commission on Climate Change, right? Yes.
Yeah, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. They hate the U.S. there. Why? Because we come with no tons and no money. And they want to be paid for our old emissions, and they want to be paid to transform, and they want us to commit legally to reduce our. We're not going to do any of those things. Flip it around and go to the states, and let's start with Missouri, which is the show me state, I think, right? If you do the right thing, if you build the right technologies, if you prove it's cost effective, they will imitate, they will follow, they will join you. And again, Hank Paulson said yesterday, is cooperation or competition? It's a nice mixture of each. So in California uses half as much energy per capita as the US as a whole. They flattened out when Jerry Brown was governor the first time, and the US kept going up. So, and it saves about $1,000 per family per year. Not a bad deal, right? California, as I mentioned before, signed contracts to get 1/3 of its energy from renewable sources. California is where the American dream lives, in the minds of the Chinese, not Washington, D.C. Right. So there are now 30 states that are moving in this direction. That's how we're gonna work with other countries.
And how about U.S.-China in particular? Are they more working together, working at odds? How would you describe that landscape and that interaction?
So there's been a nice shift, and by far the most important moment of this was when President Xi Jinping and President Obama met in Sunnyland. It was about 100 degrees recently, and they agreed to work together to cut the emissions of HFCs, hydrofluorochloro somethings. These are incredibly potent greenhouse gases, and they're very cheap to get rid of, and that's a big deal. If that is done, if that is followed through, and that's not certain, but if it's followed through to full force, that equals 80 billion tons of CO2 emissions. That's a very big number. And the Chinese didn't have to do that, and Obama didn't have to do that, but they're the only two countries that can make it happen.
And what stands between their agreement and that actually happening?
There's some diplomatic mumbo-jumbo, which is that the UNFCCC is supposed to handle that problem, and they're not very good at handling that problem. And so they're trying to move it over to the Montreal Protocol, which is a brilliant methods for handling those problems. That maneuver requires international diplomacy. John Kerry's on the case. He's working on it very hard. And it's going to require some cash, single-digit billions worldwide. And I actually think what China should do right now is step up and say, we're going to put up half the money, and we're going to cause the politics to happen. It would flip their image in the world.
Because China's growth is so rapid, because its pollution is so horrible, because the connections between U.S. and China are so intense, we tend to talk a lot about the U.S. and Chinese interactions. How about other places like India or big oil producers in the Middle East or Africa? What's the general picture on how the U.S. is working with them or not working with them?
In a lot of these places, the U.S. is not that relevant. I mean, India is such a vast, complicated, domestically driven economy. And the problems they have are so profound and so severe compared to the ones even in China. There's a very strong popular sentiment in India, probably stronger than any other country I've visited, to go to clean energy right away and to skip the dirty phases. But the political system is so sclerotic, it's hard to translate that into actionable policy. Nonetheless, they've done a lot of good things. They have a tax on coal in India, and they use the money to pay for solar. We don't do that, right? So in India's, I have a lot of hope for India, but it's a very long process. I think the Middle East is fascinating. Right now, they burn oil in the Middle East to make electricity. Therefore, the opportunity cost of that is extremely high. And so they've made huge commitments to solar recently, which makes sense, right? They want to sell the oil. They got plenty of sunshine. Just go. I don't know how fast it'll happen, but again, they have plenty of capital, so that could be a game changer.
So I'm going to return now to the fear and hope balance and just ask you to go into this a little more before I turn it over to members of the audience for questions. I think everybody here, everybody who takes the time to attend one of these ideas festivals is interested in and concerned by the ways in which societies deal with their challenges. You know, it strikes me, I've spent a lot of my life living outside the United States. America's objective challenges are relatively modest, and with small changes in its policy, it could address them. This is one of the bigger ones. Through our history as a society, we've had ways to deal with big challenges. My magazine, The Atlantic, as Anna DeVere-Smith was saying at that wonderful presentation, was founded as an anti-slavery magazine. And that was its initial commitment. There have been other big crusade, tumultuous moments in our history in the 1890s. Certainly, as you said, in World War II, we transformed everything. How would you equate both the politics and sort of the ethics of this moment to other parts of our history? What is this like? It's not like World War II because nobody has attacked us. It's not yet like the sort of not like the civil rights movement in the 1960s or even the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, although you could say that Las Vegas is similar to that. So how do you think about this in the larger sense of democratic societies that tend to be driven by inertia and rather just pay attention to their own families, confronting large, slow problems?
Well, you nailed it, Jim, because this is a large problem in the sense that it transcends national boundaries. There's no one country, even China, that can solve this, or even the U.S. And so you have to have tacit or explicit cooperation. Well, that's hard. Anything that transcends national boundaries also transcends job descriptions. It's nobody's job description to save the earth, right? It's your job description to defend your own country. And then there's the time, slow, right? This is a 10-year problem, it's a 100-year problem, it's a millennial problem even. And people aren't paid to think past the next quarterly report or the next election cycle or the next news deadline, for goodness sakes. So we have to do something that's unnatural, which is we have to quit living by instinct and live by intelligence. And human beings are not especially wired to that. The Ideas Festival is a good place to begin that journey. That said, we have at times grappled with big problems and dealt with them quickly. The Montreal Protocol I mentioned earlier. Now that was a simple fix, but you know what, if they hadn't done that, we would have destroyed the ozone layer and actually killed millions of people and millions of species as a consequence. That was a very fast, quick, we went from science to reality.
And why was that possible?
Well, The real answer is because it was chemistry and not thermodynamics. You can get factors of 100 in chemistry easy. New cars today emit 99% less conventional pollutants than old cars. Nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, and so forth. But thermodynamics gives you 1% at a time, and it's really hard. And so to double the fuel efficiency of the car is a 10 or 15 or 25-year project. The other thing is, it was a tiny part of the economy for which there were ready substitutes, and energy is ubiquitous. And there are no ready substitutes for energy except intelligence and energy efficiency.
And you made one point as an aside that I think it's obvious once you think about it, but it's really worth absorbing, which is the fact that Moore's law does not apply to energy production. And would you expand on that for a second, because it really is important to absorb that.
So Moore's law is the idea that chip speeds and computing capacity doubles every 18 months. That's what, a 70% improvement per year or something like that. Thermodynamics is the most unyielding of all sciences, and thermodynamics is very simply the amount of useful energy you get out of something compared to the amount of raw energy you put into it. So in an automobile today, we get about 20% of the energy in gasoline comes out in motive force, and 80% goes up the tailpipe in heat. It's a pretty depressing number. The best power plants in the world are 65% efficient. They're not going to get to 75% very easily. You can do tricks and get them up there if you do, like in Sweden, they do combined heat and power and so on. But you're not going to get doublings and doublings and doublings, right? You, however, can get the subtractions on that order. And this is what's interesting. This is why energy efficiency is such a breakaway. As I mentioned, 90% reduction in energy from lighting. That's a pretty great deal. You can do that in all kinds of processes. I talked to a very senior technologist yesterday who thinks you can eliminate the need for carbon emissions from cement. That's 5% of global CO2, right? So subtraction is nonlinear, but production is a little more tricky.
One last question, then I will ask people to go to the microphones back there. So, as societies deal with change, there are some challenges that you can deal with on an individual level, sort of individual boycotts, individual purchasing decisions or whatever, and there's some that require systemic changes, otherwise it's just meaningless. You know, I could decide never to turn the lights on in my house. That would be much worse for me than it would be good for the world's energy system. Are there any individual behavior changes that actually make sense in this field, or is it more a matter of if you don't change the system, it doesn't matter?
I'm going to give you my old answer and my new answer because they're slightly different. My old answer was, much as you say, I believed in what we call the green citizen instead of the green consumer. The green consumer walks around and buys recycled toilet paper and green light bulbs and stuff. Green citizenship doesn't amount to a hill of beans, honestly. Then there's the green consumer. Green consumer doesn't. The green citizen insists that we run our apparatus, our political apparatus, in a way that delivers ever better results. And that's the renewable portfolio standards or the fuel efficiency standards. But here's why I need to adjust that a little bit. There's a link between the political and the personal. And so when you go to your house and fix it up and put some solar panels on and get a negative electricity bill, my electricity bill last month was minus $105. Wow. You know, you become a believer, right? It's not that hard. It didn't take any time at all to turn my house into an energy source. I mean, really.
But it also required a system change to set up the grid that way.
To be sure. But the point of it is, if you do that, if half the people in this room do that, they're going to talk to their friends, they're going to talk to their political leaders. It takes it out of the world of mumbo jumbo and puts it into the world of reality.
Yes, so in the far back, we'll start back there, and I think microphones will come to you.
Hi, great talk. I'm David McConville with the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and I'm curious about something you referenced earlier, kind of this distinction between geoengineering and what you might call eco-engineering, where a lot of the large-scale interventions that are discussed from a purely engineering perspective aren't really taking the entire system into account, versus things like holistic management, reforestation. And I'm curious, in the calculus of what you've been looking at, have you seen kind of a quantified understanding of what these types of eco-engineering approaches could do that work with ecosystems instead of just trying to intervene within them?
I've seen snippets, but not a cohesive whole. I mean, one kind of geoengineering that we're doing is tearing down the world's forests, right? That's geoengineering. It's not very smart. So stopping that solves about 20% of the problem. So you might call stopping something bad a kind of geoengineering. Art Rosenfeld, a physicist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, says, what if you replace all the roofs in the world with white roofs? And you do it as they fall apart. That turns out to give you high single digits returns against this problem. That's not a hard thing to go along with. My own sense is that you should do things on a scale where you're not going to cause catastrophic failure, right? And that is an ecological scale that you have to be able to understand. If you're going to plant trees, plant native species, right? You can even do small scale things that wreak havoc, and you shouldn't do that. But I think you have to understand nature's designed for a certain resilient outcome, and if you tamper with that in a major way, you're going to get whacked.
So I can't see very well, so I'm going to ask the microphone holders just to go to people, and so whoever the microphone holders have, they're the deciders. Yes.
CO2 that comes out, can it be recycled again and used in some way?
I mean, being captured at the smokestack or after it gets into the atmosphere?
Capture it at the smokestack and therefore turn it into something useful.
Can you capture CO2 after fossil fuels are burned and use that for productive use? It is right now being used, ironically, for enhanced oil recovery. So you go to an old oil field that's not doing so good and you pump a lot of CO2 in there and you get some more oil out. That's economical. It's actually an interesting strategy to develop new technologies. If you're going to do sequestration of the general idea of carbon capture and sequestration is that you capture the carbon, you separate it from other exhaust gases, you compress it until it's a liquid, you pipe it to a stable geological reservoir, you stuff it down in there, and then you put a plug on it. And that's carbon capture and sequestration. The problem with it is it pretty well doubles the cost of electricity. And nobody wants to do that since there's no price on carbon today. It also requires engineering feats of absolutely heroic proportion. There are ideas about using carbon dioxide for cement, which didn't pan out. They use it in Coca-Cola, but it's not much.
And then Pepsi.
Excuse me, Pepsi as well.
Yeah. So yes, so would I microphone? Yes, somebody over here, I think, yes.
Can you talk to the economics of the renewables? In other words, as we look forward, what today and what 25 years from now is likely to be the most economically attractive renewable? I thought your comments on using gas was very enlightening, because what you're saying is you use that when you can't use something else, you can turn it on, you can turn it off. But the economics today, if you remove all government subsidies and you just look at what it costs, how does wind stack up against solar, against nuclear, and so on?
It's a great question. First of all, ideally, you would strip all subsidies and take a look at the problem then. We spend about 4 times as much subsidizing fossil fuel in this country as we do subsidizing renewable energy, but we subsidize them both. So it's not exactly an unlevel playing field so much as a really lumpy, weird one. Second, the value of energy depends on the market into which it's sold and the type of energy it is. So an electron delivered in Las Vegas at 4 in the afternoon on a 117-degree day is worth a lot more than an electron delivered at 2 in the morning in North Dakota, or somewhere like, So those answers, it depends. Then there's the trends. Today's solar panels are more expensive than a new natural gas turbine. Quite a bit more expensive, 2 or 3 times more expensive, but they've dropped 80% in the last 4 years. So what's your bet going to be on the next 4 years? And then natural gas prices are volatile. Solar prices are stable. I mean, sunshine prices are stable at 0. What's the price of volatility? If you're going to do a 20-year investment, do you think natural gas is going to be at $3.50 for 20 years, or do you presume it might go up or might go down? And what's the economic weight you put on that? Okay, enough caveats. You want the answer. So right now, on a new build basis, wind is competitive with gas and better than coal. In special circumstances, comprising about 15 to 18% of the electricity market, solar is cheaper than conventional sources. In other words, if you put it in an overloaded substation where you have a lot of sunshine, those are today's prices. Nobody's building any new coal-fired power plants because they're not economical, but people are building a lot of new natural gas-fired power plants. Natural gas turbines are very cheap, and natural gas is very cheap, and there's a lot of it. So natural gas is the biggest, it's actually now interestingly, the second biggest marginal growth. Wind is now the biggest in America. It's growing faster. There's more installations of wind than any other technology, which is kind of amazing. Should I do 2 minutes on nuclear?
Sure. Go for it.
So you have to think of nuclear in 3 generations. Generation 2, which is what we have everywhere, they're all being shut down in the next 20 to 30 years. Why? Because they become brittle after they're bombarded with radioactivity for that long. It has nothing to do with license extensions. They're cheap to operate. They're bloody expensive to repair because you have to repair them with robots. So they're going away. It's a physical fact, even in France. The 3rd generation nuclear is what's being built now. They built one in Finland. They're building one in France. They're building a couple dozen in Asia. The problem with them is they're expensive. The one in Finland is going to cost $11 billion for one power plant, right? So a factor of 5 more expensive than coal, factor of 15 more expensive than natural gas. So I predict that generation 3 is going to peter out after 3 or 4 dozen reactors. Then there's generation 4. And generation 4 is really neat because it's small, it's modular, it's proliferation resistant, it's cheap. It only has one problem. It doesn't exist. So they have to invent it. And I'm not pessimistic about this possibility, but it's a very serious technical challenge. And in fact, there's no one idea, there's about 10 ideas. So if we're serious about nuclear power having a future, and nothing I've said, by the way, is pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. These are just numbers. If you're serious about having a nuclear future, you have to invest mightily in generation 4 and see if you can get there. And nobody's doing that.
This is very interesting. So I'm going to say a word about wind, then take a question or two in just the remaining minutes. So one of my ways I explore America, I'm a longtime small plane pilot. I have a little, very fuel-efficient single-engine plane that I fly around the heartland. And so I've been over those places in North Dakota and Wyoming, which were astonishing. But when I was flying here from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, 5 days ago, it was astonishing. You cross the Nebraska to Colorado state line, and suddenly there are more windmills than you can count.
Yeah.
I must have seen 5,000 windmills in just that part of Colorado, which I assume is a state regulatory difference between Nebraska and Colorado, but there are windmills all over the place, and so that was cheering. A question over here.
I have a specific U.S. policy question. Given what you've said about the U.S.-Chinese relationship on climate change and so on, what's your perspective on debates in states like Montana on mining coal to export it to China, to create employment?
Yes, exporting American coal, sending it to China. What's the over-under?
It's like playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets instead of 6. I mean, it's like stupid. Really, people say coal is fungible. And if they don't buy it from us, they'll buy it from Australia. Well, there's people in Australia that would like to sell a little bit less coal to China as well, right? And you can have, I don't think morality at the end of the day is fungible, even if commodities may be. So we have to stop coal. There is no physical alternative if we want to save the Earth.
But let me just press you on this. I will tell you as a matter of fact that if the United States doesn't sell them that coal, they are going to either mine it domestically or get it from somebody else.
Okay, but let's say half a dozen nations make it more difficult. Canada, Australia, the United States, and Indonesia. Indonesia's least likely. That's where they're getting their coal. If those 4 nations make it more difficult, they've just raised the price of coal. They've put a carbon price on China. That's pretty good. So it's not infinitely fungible. And the way you stop it is by starting to stand up for what's right.
Okay. We have time for one more question. Who has a microphone and a question? So I think over here. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. I've been in a number of forums like this, and when they're talking about it, and you present a little different approach in that when people are talking about scaling it, when they look at the problem and looking at scale, and they're saying that natural gas is probably the best way to scale immediately. And one of the things that they say, because I asked them about wind, and they say wind and solar, the thing that you're not talking about is the amount of land that it takes to do that. Is there any kind of a metric between what does it take in terms of acreage to replace a gas-fired plant as opposed to do that so strictly on solar or
Right, the
wind?
energy density of wind is very different from coal and nuclear. Yeah.
So I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about any of this. Look, every energy source has problems, and every energy source can be done badly. And you can put wind in a bird flight corridor, and kill a lot of birds. That's dumb. We've learned how not to do that. You can run a transmission line through a proposed wilderness area. You can put solar panels on top of soon-to-be extinct turtles. And by the way, same with natural gas, same with coal, same with nuclear, right? So you can't get away from this question of how you do things in an ecologically and an economically intelligent way. You really have to pay attention. If you do things that are economically stupid in the name of a good cause, it will come back and whack you. It will crush itself. There's plenty of land to move to renewables without sacrificing environmental values. If you go to eastern Colorado, the highest best use of eastern Colorado is a windmill. I mean, I'm sorry.
No offense.
And the windmill, by the way, takes up less than 10% of the space. You still got 90% for the farmers, and the farmers are really happy to have a new source of cash flow.
It's made it a lot harder, a lot trickier to fly around there, though. You got to go higher.
Well,
but
you
yes.
pull that stick back, Jim.
Yes,
Come on.
It's true. So we have 30 seconds left. You have 30 seconds to give a final thought to this influential crowd before they disperse.
So this one's winnable. If we fail, the consequences, I guarantee you, are far worse than you can imagine. Hundreds of millions of dead. We will reduce agricultural productivity in Africa by about 1/3 by 2050 because of heat change alone, right? Imagine what that does. We can win this one. It's a huge job, but technology is finally on our side, and politics is moving on our side. And this is exactly the moment to pile on. This is the moment to pick up your phone, get on your computer, get your checkbook out, go to your board meetings, do what you have to do. But it's time to lock this one down.
Wise words. Thank you very much, Hal Harvey.